She was not on the list to die. No one had authorized her execution. No judge had passed sentence. No commander had given the order. But that afternoon in April 1945, when the rifles were turned on Benito Mussolini, Clara Petacci made a split-second decision, threw herself in front of him, and was struck by the gunfire as well. The next day, her body was displayed upside down at a gas station in Milan. The crowd showed no mercy. They spat, kicked, shouted. And then, far from the eyes of the world, her family, before fleeing to Spain, did something that would remain hidden for years. They hid jewelry inside the coffin with the body. 11 years later, they returned, and what they found when they opened that coffin did not seem real. It could have been a movie script, something worthy of Hollywood. But this is the story of Clara Petacci. How good it is to be together to discover what really happened. Who was Clara Petacci? To understand what happened in that square, you need to understand who this woman really was before she became a symbol of anything. Clara Petacci was born on the 28th of February, 1912, in Rome. She came from a comfortable family, well-placed socially. Her father was a doctor and had connections in the Vatican. In Italy at the time, that meant real influence. Her mother was a typical Roman bourgeois woman, concerned with reputation, appearances, and above all, with marriage alliances that could strengthen the family name. Clara grew up surrounded by stability, culture, and a kind of privilege that simply never had to be questioned, because to her, it was normal. It was the world as it had always been. Yet from a very young age, there was something that almost obsessively dominated the diaries she wrote: the figure of Benito Mussolini. It was not a distant kind of political admiration, the sort that is limited to speeches or public images. It was something more intimate, more intense, almost impossible to define precisely. Clara wrote to him as if he could somehow hear her. She created whole dialogues in her own head, imagined replies, built scenes. In practice, she was projecting a complete relationship before there had even been any real contact. It was less an ordinary infatuation and more a fixation. In 1932, what had until then existed only on paper took concrete form. Clara was 20 years old and was in a car with her fiancé when Mussolini's car crossed their path. He had them stop. It was not a chance meeting. Mussolini wanted to know who the young woman was who had caught his attention. A few minutes of conversation, nothing extraordinary on the surface, but for Clara, it was everything. That brief encounter, which would have seemed banal to any outside observer, completely changed the course of her life. The engagement ended shortly afterward, and with it, any possibility of an ordinary life also began to disappear. The difference between the two of them was enormous in every respect. Mussolini was 50 years old, the absolute leader of the Italian fascist regime, and one of the most powerful men in Europe, as well as a direct ally of Adolf Hitler. Clara, on the other hand, was a young Roman woman from the bourgeoisie, who until then had only observed that world of power from a distance, even though she had always silently imagined herself inside it. In 1934, she even married a military pilot. It was an attempt to follow the expected path for someone of her social standing, but the marriage did not last long. At bottom, it was an empty formality in the face of what was already underway. By 1936, her bond with Mussolini was firmly established. Officially, it was secret. In practice, everyone knew, but of course, no one spoke about it openly. Clara came to live in a world of privileges that few Italian women of that time could even have imagined. An apartment in the same complex as Palazzo Venezia, where Mussolini governed. A direct telephone line, constant gifts, jewelry, clothes, unrestricted access to the world that revolved around the center of power. It was a life built on closeness. But what truly sets Clara apart from so many other women in a similar position is not just those privileges, but the record she left behind. She wrote everything down with an almost obsessive level of detail, Phone calls, meetings, every fit of jealousy, every reconciliation. She took gestures as proof of love. Nothing seemed too small to be recorded. The diaries that survived, and that were published decades later, do not stand out for their political content. On the contrary, she barely discussed government decisions, strategies, or historical events. What makes them striking is their emotional intensity, the way she turned that relationship into the absolute axis of her own existence. Everything revolved around that. In almost everyone's eyes, Mussolini was a dictator responsible for mass suffering, repression, and institutionalized violence. But to Clara, our protagonist, he was something entirely different. He was the center of her universe. But the madness does not stop there. In 1938, while Clara slept on silk sheets in an apartment paid for by Mussolini, he was signing the Italian racial laws. Jewish citizens lost access to public jobs. Children were expelled from schools. Entire families saw their property confiscated and their lives collapse by force of law. All of this was happening at the same time. Clara received gifts, lived surrounded by protection, and remained immersed in that world built around a single figure. The contrast is bizarre. It is unsettling. In 1943, when Italy began to collapse, when the Allies landed in Sicily and the fascist regime started to crack from the inside out, Clara stayed by Mussolini's side, even as everything around them was falling apart. The end of the regime and the couple's downfall. We come to the 28th of April, 1945. By then, there was no turning back. The Second World War was in its final days, and the fate of many of its main figures was beginning to be sealed for good. Mussolini was trying to cross into Switzerland, hidden in a convoy of retreating German soldiers. It was a desperate escape. In the town of Dongo, on the shores of Lake Como, Italian partisans intercepted the convoy. They searched truck by truck without hurrying. They knew someone important might be there, and they found him. The former dictator was disguised in a German military overcoat, trying to go unnoticed in the middle of the retreat. A man who only a few years earlier had commanded crowds was now trying to disappear like just another defeated soldier. Clara was not in the same convoy. When she learned what had happened, she made a decision that historians still debate to this day. She gave herself up voluntarily. She had time to flee, she had money, she had enough contacts to disappear in the chaos of that moment. Italy was collapsing, and in the middle of that collapse, disappearing was a real possibility. But she did not try. She went after him. The two were taken to Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzegra, a simple house on the shore of the lake. An ordinary place, far too quiet for what was about to happen. The kind of setting that gives no hint of an ending. Yet it ended up becoming the stage for one of the most symbolic endings of the war in Italy. The man identified in the historical records as the executioner is Walter Audizio, associated with the National Liberation Committee. To this day, there is still debate over the chain of command, whether there was direct influence from Moscow, who gave the final order, and at what level that decision was made. Those questions were never fully resolved, but the central facts remain clear. At 4:10 in the afternoon on April 28, 1945, Mussolini and Clara were taken to the villa gate. Clara was not formally on the execution list, had not been tried, and at that moment posed no military threat. Institutionally, she was nothing more than the dictator's companion, but she was there. When she realized what was about to happen, she reacted in the only way that seemed possible to her, the same way she had reacted throughout her life. She placed herself beside him. Testimonies describe a tense, confused scene, with shouting and abrupt movements. In the final moment, Clara threw herself forward, trying to place her own body between Mussolini and the weapons. The weapon used was a 9mm Beretta pistol. The shots were multiple, rapid, direct. The two of them fell there in front of the gate, with Lake Como in the background. She died trying to protect him, and in a way, That sums up her entire path to that point. But it was the next day that the real terror happened. Before we continue talking about Clara and Mussolini, tell me what you think of today's content. Have you subscribed yet? Don't forget to turn on notifications and leave a like, all right? Also, leave a comment if you want more stories. That way, the platform understands that our work is relevant and we can keep growing here. We are very grateful for your support. You are essential to keeping this work going. Clara and Mussolini were already dead, but the public still wanted revenge. On the 29th of April, 1945, the corpses were taken by truck to Piazzale Loreto. It was not just any place. Thousands of people had passed through it over the 2 decades of fascism. People who had lost children in the war, who had watched the regime promise greatness and deliver ruin, who had lived for years under fear, silence, and forced obedience. That morning, all of it came to the surface. Mussolini was unloaded first, then Clara, then the others. What happened in the next few minutes was recorded in photographs that still circulate today. The crowd moved in quickly. There were kicks, spit, insults, shouts coming from somewhere deep, built up over years of repression. It was not just anger in the moment. It was something that had been held back for a very long time. The photographer Fedele Toscani recorded that scene. The images entered the history books and endured across the decades. One in particular became a symbol of the end of Italian fascism. The bodies hanging from the metal frame of a gas station. 6 figures upside down, Benito Mussolini in the center, Clara at his side. A raw image, hard to ignore and impossible to forget. After hours on display, the bodies were removed from the square and taken to the Institute of Legal Medicine in Milan. The Petacci family asked for Clara's body. The request was granted, but there was a practical problem. Burying her under her real name would mean creating a target. The war was over, but the hatred was still there, still alive. A grave with the name Petacci in a public cemetery could easily attract vandalism, violence, perhaps even something worse. The solution they found was simple and brutal. Erase the name. They chose the municipal cemetery of Musocco on the outskirts of Milan, a discreet place, far from the center, far from public attention. On the coffin, the name was not Clara Petacci. It was Rita Colfosco. It was grave 384, with no headstone, no identifying marker, no public ceremony, no visible flowers, no sign of who was really there. Clara Petacci was buried like a stranger in a workers' cemetery, in an anonymous coffin under an invented name, as if she had never existed. Benito Mussolini was buried in the same cemetery, but in a different place. The separation was not accidental, it was intentional. The Petacci family did not want the two of them to be close, not even symbolically. That would attract too much attention, too much curiosity, too much risk. And there was also an attempt at rupture. She had spent the last 9 years of her life trying to get close to him. She died beside him, but she was buried separately, without a name, without an identity, as if that whole story had been erased along with the body. The story, however, does not end here. Greed and the unanswered mystery. 11 years later, the Petacci family returned from exile in Spain. Italy was no longer the same. The Republic was firmly established, fascism had been outlawed, and the immediate hatred of those first post-war years had cooled enough for the name Petacci to be spoken without immediate risk. The memory was still there, and so was judgment, but the same impulse toward destruction was gone. It was in this context that the family submitted an official request to the Italian authorities. They wanted to exhume Clara's body and transfer it to Rome, to Verano Cemetery, where they could visit her with dignity and, this time, with her real name engraved in the marble. The request was granted. The reasoning was simple. Memory, family respect, a dignified burial, even if delayed. But there was a second reason. one that did not appear in any document. Before fleeing to Spain in 1945, the family had made a disturbing decision: to hide the jewels inside the coffin alongside Clara's body. It was not entirely unusual in that context. Wealthy families who had to flee in haste, unable to transport large valuables safely, sometimes resorted to unlikely hiding places, places where no one would think to look. And an anonymous coffin under a false name in a forgotten grave in a cemetery on the outskirts was exactly that kind of place. 11 years later, when they opened grave number 384 in Musocco Cemetery and exhumed what remained of Rita Colonel Fosco, they found a diamond ring, a medallion adorned with 17 diamonds, and a handwritten note in Benito Mussolini's hand. The note was never reproduced in full in official sources, but fragments of it were cited by historians over the years. It was a personal declaration, something intimate. 9 years of an unlikely relationship condensed into a few handwritten lines. Clara had kept that paper as if it were the most valuable thing she owned. She took it to the grave, and it remained there for 11 years beside the body, beside the jewels, inside a coffin bearing the wrong name, buried in silence. Perhaps it really was the most valuable thing she had. And this is where the story starts to become more unsettling. Where did those jewels come from? Mussolini gave Clara gifts regularly. That is a documented fact. But the historical context raises a question that has never been answered definitively. In 1938, the Italian fascist regime passed the racial laws. Jewish citizens lost their citizenship, access to public sector jobs, the right to education, and basic legal protection. In 1943, with the Nazi occupation in northern Italy, the persecution escalated into mass deportations, and along with the people came property, real estate, bank accounts, personal belongings, including jewelry. Historians who have studied the period have raised an unsettling hypothesis. Some of the gifts circulating within the regime, according that reached Clara, may have come from property confiscated from persecuted families. In the specific case of the jewels found during the exhumation in 1956, this was never officially confirmed, but it was never denied either. Where did the diamond ring and the medallion with 17 stones come from? From a jeweler who was paid regularly? From property taken from families who had lost everything? From some official trying to win favor with the regime through expensive gifts? History does not answer. Present day, while Clara was buried under a false name and virtually forgotten by a family that crossed the border into Spain, Benito Mussolini met a different, though no less disturbing, fate. In 1946, a group of neo-fascists stole Mussolini's body from Musocco Cemetery. The corpse disappeared and remained hidden for 11 years, exactly the same length of time that Clara lay in grave 384 under a name that was not hers. For more than a decade, no one knew for certain where the body was. In 1957, the Italian government returned the remains to the Mussolini family, which carried out the burial in Predoppio, in the Emilia-Romagna region, in the family crypt. And it was there that the story took an unexpected turn. Predoppio became a pilgrimage destination. Every year, on the anniversaries of Mussolini's birth and death, groups of nostalgists make the trip, buy souvenirs, take photos in the crypt, and walk through the town as if they were visiting a historical landmark worthy of reverence. The phenomenon of Italian fascist tourism is documented. It is real. Clara was transferred to the Verano Cemetery in Rome. A pink marble tomb, her real name at last. Everything in the right place, at least in appearance, but with no cult, no movement, no political relevance that could turn that place into a destination for visitors. Silence. In 2015, journalists who visited the tomb at Verano found clear signs of neglect. The marble was deteriorating, with visible cracks. There was no maintenance, no care. Once again, it was a forgotten place. In 2017, A group of Roman citizens with no connection to the Petacci family and no political agenda, driven only by a mix of historical curiosity and passion, decided to act. They organized an informal collection and restored the tomb. It was not the family and it was not the state. It was anonymous people who, for some reason, looked at it and felt that there was something wrong in that neglect. The difference is hard to ignore. Mussolini has an organized annual pilgrimage. Catherine has strangers who one day felt sorry for the broken marble. And that is not even the worst of it. Whatever the case, remember that Clara died for love, but was exhumed for money. Now that you have followed this entire journey, from Villa Beamte to Musocco Cemetery, from the jewels hidden in the coffin to the note forgotten for more than a decade, from the brutal scene in Piazzale Loreto to the tomb quietly restored years later, I want to know your opinion. Was Clara Petacci a victim of her own choices, a woman consumed by a blind devotion to Benito Mussolini, or someone who, fully aware of everything, was part of a system that destroyed thousands of lives and still benefited from it? But if you had been there in the mid-1950s, knowing that there might be jewels inside that coffin, possibly taken from families persecuted under the racial laws, what would you have done? History rarely offers easy answers, and this case is proof of that. If this video made you think or reflect in any way, leave a like and subscribe. It seems simple, but it makes an enormous difference and ensures that more stories like this keep reaching you. Thank you very much, and until next time.